Goss's wilt is our most important disease in the state because we can see yield reductions up to 40 to 50% depending on severity of injury. We do have some great management tools, with our most important one being hybrid resistance. First thing that we're going to often see is this leaf burning. Sometimes we tend to see it in the upper canopy first, and you're going to start seeing these lesions start from the tip and then work their way. Oftentimes we start seeing symptoms after rain injury, hail, when the bacteria is able to access into the host plant. As you start seeing the progression of this necrosis and chlorosis down the leaf tissue, you're also going to see water soaking. And near the water soaking, you're going to see freckling as well. At one time, this disease was known as leaf freckles disease because of characteristic freckles you can see within the lesions. On a dewy morning, sometimes you can see the bacteria ooze out of these lesions and creates almost like a glazed donut, almost like a shiny grease spot. We start looking about management, hybrid resistance, our most important thing. Right now, behind me, we have a susceptible hybrid. You can see that the necrosis is starting to dry this plant down quicker. As we move through this hybrid performance trial, you're going to see a couple things. One is you're going to see that it's going to start to turn greener as we switch to another hybrid. Now, not only is this going to have a little bit more resistance, but it can still get some Goss's wilt lesions, but you're going to notice that those lesions are going to be walled off, and they're not going to be able to spread as severe as we saw with the susceptible hybrid. If you want to compare and contrast the importance of hybrid selection, the studies that we have done with with funding from the North Dakota Corn Utilization Council, susceptible hybrids in a year when they get infected early, you can see that 40 to 50% reduction in yield. In those same trials, when a resistant hybrid was used, you reduce that down to 3 to 5%. Hence the really big importance of Goss's wilt. If you find it in your field, make sure you're looking for those resistant hybrids.
Let's get right down to the meat and potatoes here. You know, when I first started in Steele County as the county extension agent, I'm going to be honest with you, Andrew, we weren't talking a lot about corn diseases, and especially Goss's wilt. That was kind of a foreign disease for us. And a couple years later, we had a really bad outbreak. We had a high incidence level within our own Steele County corn hybrid trials, and it surprised us. I mean, we didn't see it coming. And why has this disease become so prevalent recently? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when I think about that similar question I get, no matter what part of the state it is, I go back to how we think about corn in general with diseases. So, we don't have a lot of corn diseases, which we're really thankful for. We don't have to deal with a lot of the fungal leaf spots as you see in the I states. But the one disease, as you mentioned, Goss's wilt can turn a field upside down. And when you think about this in real time, is this disease usually takes a couple years for it to really rear its ugly head. In some cases, you may not have seen Goss's wilt in a small pocket here or there in a field. It's tough to scout a cornfield. Walking through it early with drones, you can do a much better job. But the idea is, as soon as you start throwing a susceptible hybrid into that rotation, you can kind of see this snowball effect. And by the time we have an issue, when you see these complete field burn downs, it makes a very big, what I would say, a Kodak moment in a lot of ways.
So I have a question then for you, Angie. You know, say I missed the boat on my hybrid selection, right? I've planted a susceptible hybrid. I'm starting to notice I have some Goss's wilt. Is there anything that can be sprayed economically on the corn to fix that Goss's wilt, Angie?
Oh, Abby, I get this question so many times from growers. And like Andrew mentioned, this is a bacterial disease. And so, you know, typically at our spraying options, you know, a lot of times when it comes to disease control, we look at our fungicides, right? But like Andrew mentioned, this beast is a bacterial issue. And so really, there's nothing that we can come in and I don't want to sound like a negative person, but I don't want you to spend your money because there isn't a product that's going to kill that bacteria. And Andrew, do you have any comments on that as well?
Yeah, Angie, you hit the nail on the head. Is when we look at what I call the rescue application, when you start seeing a cornfield go down, we just don't have those tools. So there's a couple products labeled. Most of them are copper-based type of plant protection products. There's also hydrogen peroxide, I think, is labeled too. And we've looked at these products, and specifically last year with funding from the Corn Council. And Although for a copper product, you may see a slight reduction, it's not preserving that yield. So at the end of the day, if you make that input decision, you always have to see how it pencils out. It's just not something that we're equipped for right now. And honestly, when it comes to bacterial diseases, when that seed goes into the ground, our management tools are right there.
Such a great point. And you've actually in your video, and I love the screen behind you. I mean, you showcase the disease all the time. It helps us get a good visual of what we're looking at. And it seems like such a late season disease. And if it's later in the season, why does it have such an impact on our corn yields?
That's another really good question. So when we start thinking about the impact on corn yields with this disease, oftentimes we, human nature, don't start scouting for this until well after tasseling. And it is likely that those infections have started much earlier. And as I was mentioning in the video about the yield loss potential is, we can see up to 40 to 50%. And when I went back to the data and looked at this in a different way, this is the best way how I could interpret it. So if you grow a susceptible hybrid and you're at that R1, so right after the tasseling growth stage, for every 1% in disease severity on a single plant, you're losing about 2 bushels an acre. So if you have a very high disease severity at tasseling at R1, that is where that yield is going to start coming down. But if it's a late disease onset, for example, where it doesn't set in until later, even on a susceptible hybrid, you don't see as much of a yield reduction. That's something that's very key is with any disease. It all depends on when that disease is onset, and you can almost mark when we start seeing the most yield loss. And the biggest role here is if you look at the same analogy with a mildly resistant hybrid, you really don't see much of an impact because it's able to wall off those infections.
So Andrew, if we can go back to that slide, you want to talk a little bit about, there we go. You want to talk a little bit about, you've got 3 corn leaves here. What's going on? Because you kind of gave me a sneak peek that not all of them are Goss's wilt, right?
Yeah, so I think it's probably the most common question right now is, in general case, once you see this disease, it always sticks with you just because there's a lot of characteristics, one being the freckles. But what I'm showing you here is there's 1 corn leaf with Goss's wilt, and then there's 2 what I call mimics. And the top leaf here is Goss's wilt, and if we were to look closer at that, you'd see leaf freckles with the disease was first named, and you're going to see water soaking. The other 2 are not Goss's wilt. The second one is a leaf miner injury, which you can maybe see in the bottom of that middle of that leaf there. It looks a little bit like the start of a Goss's lesion, but it's going to be more papery texture. You can actually see the insect. And probably the most common mimic is what I call the abiotic stressors in corn. So on the bottom leaf, it looks like you have streaking. It looks like it could be the start of Goss's wilt, but this is something else at play. And how to really separate a bacterial disease such as Goss's wilt from the rest out there. Look for that water soaking, look for the bacterial ooze, look for those freckles. Those are the 3 key things that when I talk to anybody on Goss's wilt identification. And just something important to keep in mind is you have to identify the disease first before you start developing that management program.
So I have a question, Andrew. With a lot of these diseases and other parts of our system, we can rotate our way out of them with crop rotation. And is crop rotation also a part of this with hybrid selection as well?
Yeah, so that's one of the corners, or I'm going to say there's 2 corners when we think about it as far as some of the cultural practices we can do. Crop rotation helps. And the biggest reason is this bacteria survives about 8 to 10 months on the leaf tissue. So if you're able to rotate a year out, that within field inoculum is necessarily going to go away. But with the ability of corn residue to spread quite easily in the harvest season, just because you're doing it, and you go across the road, you might see Goss's wilt develop on the field edges. And it's not because it just came out of nowhere. It's just likely the residue transfer. And similarly, it could go back the other way at a given year. So it does help in the big grand scheme of things. And that's something I do look at. The other thing with residue management, the quicker that residue is broken down, the bacteria doesn't have as long as a shelf life on it. So that's one really what I call a nice thing. And what I say, kind of the Achilles heel of a bacterial disease is it doesn't have that 2 to 3 or up to 8 years on some of these fungal and fungal-like organisms.
Well, that's kind of a positive to hear this morning that we're not set in for life with this. But I want to make sure, growers out there that are listening this morning, I know each and every one of you. I want you to go ahead, type in that Q&A box, type in that chat box, because now is your time to ask the expert. We've got Andrew with us. We've got Abby. I don't think I myself am quite an expert quite yet, but maybe one day. And so we really want you as growers to be engaged in this conversation as well. And we are seeing it. We have had some very highlighted varieties that I've noticed throughout the county that are showing signs of Goss's wilt. And like you said, Andrew, resistance really is our number one, tool in the toolbox at this time.
Yeah, and if I could break down the resistance aspect a little bit, some questions we get on that is, how do I compare the resistance if it's across companies or even within the same company? And most of these are going to be done individually, and generally you want to select the best one that has to offer. I don't have a comparison of what a rating of 3 is across 6 different companies, but the idea is to really work with you, Angie, as our extension agent, but also just some of the familiar knowledge you've had, putting your boots on the ground and looking at some of these hot spots with diseases.
Well, one thing I can kind of see from the picture behind you, Andrew, is that with Goss's wilt, it looks like the canopy of the corn opens up quite a bit. So that maybe would let more light in below the canopy and maybe impact or weed pressures as well. Is that something you're seeing too, as kind of a building effect?
That's a good observation. So, you do definitely lose the canopy aspect because it is an ultimate defoliator. And some of the worst fields that I looked at, and one that comes to mind right away was in early August, late July. I was walking through a field where, literally I wasn't being able to be touched by any corn leaves because all you left were stalks, and a lot of late season weed flushes could more or less exacerbate the issue to another pest issue because of this. So it's a very good observation, and that does happen. And it's something I haven't looked at other than just like, oh, yep, that's something that could contribute to another reason why we need to manage the disease.
I think some of those late season weeds is water hemp. So I'm out of my realm here at soil health, but is water hemp a late season weed, or some of the other ones that can be resistant?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're actually starting to see more water hemp pressure, especially surprisingly coming off our small grain harvest. And that's when we're as producers and even myself, I'm kind of concerned how we're starting to see that water hemp emerge later on in the growing season, especially within our small grains, just because we have more, control options within that crop.
What are those losses that you can expect with Goss's wilt again?
Yeah, so it depends on your hybrid, but the research that we have used have shown that if you get an infection early in the growing season, so we'll call it 8 to 10 leaves out, on a susceptible hybrid, we've seen up to 40 to 50% yield loss. In those same trials, those same studies, the mildly susceptible hybrid, you can cut that about half. So you start talking about 25% yield loss, and then a resistant hybrid, it's 3 to 5%. So there's a very big benefit from resistance, especially with this bacterial disease. And those are what I call high disease environments. If you ask me a question that says, I found Goss's wilt and it's the middle of August and I found it in one spot in the field, not going to see a whole much yield loss in those cases. It's really those situations when you see the disease start early on. So I always hate using the term, it depends, but it's just kind of something you have to think about in real time, when that disease may set in and how much yield loss you can expect.
Is there any other follow-up that we missed, Andrew, that you really want to hit home this morning?
My message always with Goss's wilt, and kind of my big thing is, if you find it, don't panic. It's not like this is disease that's only going to be found in your field. We have found this disease now with some of our survey efforts all the way in Southeast North Dakota, all the way out to Williston. So the idea with this disease is it's likely around, and it's not because you have it and your neighbor didn't have it. It's just likely around. It's something here to stay. But we have some excellent management tools, whether that's your cultural practices, the importance of crop rotation, or some of the residue management and the selection of hybrid. And when I think about this in general terms, somebody may ask, can we ever get 100% handle on this disease? I think that we can get very close with some of our tools, but it'll never be a complete eradication of this disease, just because it can survive on corn, and we have a lot of corn, but there's a few grassy weed hosts like the foxtails that it can survive on as well. So it's unfortunately, the disease is just well equipped to survive in our state.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining today.